Have you ever noticed how silence makes people nervous? Not because they don't understand you, but because they can no longer control you. You stop explaining, you stop defending, you stop reacting, and suddenly they feel powerless because your silence is not absence. It's presence sharpened to a blade. It's the moment the storm stops, not because it passed, but because something inside you chose not to scream. The truth? People aren't afraid when you yell. They're afraid when you smile and say nothing. When you stop arguing, stop proving, stop chasing, because the day you choose silence is the day you stop playing by their rules. And that's when you become dangerous. Silence is not what they think it is. It is not weakness. It is not defeat. It is not the void that follows failure. True silence, the kind that shakes rooms, is power under restraint. A blade still in its sheath, a fire held behind the teeth. Rollo May, the father of existential psychology, taught that real power comes not from control over others, but from the mastery of one's own being, especially when that mastery involves restraint. To choose silence in a world addicted to noise is not retreat, it's ascension. Most people talk to be accepted, not to be understood. They perform with words. They explain, soften, negotiate, plead, just to be allowed in the room. But silence refuses entry to those terms. It does not ask for permission. It does not apologize for its existence. It does not shrink or clarify. It simply is. And that's why it unnerves people. Because silence removes the script. It leaves them with nothing to push against, so they push inward. They begin to hear their own voices, their own fear, their own shame echoing in the absence of your reaction. That's when they realize they've lost access, not to your words, but to your vulnerability. You used to speak from fear. Every explanation was a plea. Every reaction was a bid to be understood. You were trained to believe that silence was suspicious, that if you didn't defend yourself, you must be guilty. But what if the opposite is true? What if silence is not weakness, but evolution? What if your refusal to engage is the beginning of real sovereignty? Rollo May believed that courage is not found in the act of aggression, but in the stillness that follows understanding. And once you understand your worth, you no longer beg to be seen. You no longer chase clarity from people who benefit from your confusion. You realize that not every wound deserves a response. Not every insult deserves a correction. Not every invitation to conflict is worthy of attendance. Silence becomes your sword. It says, without speaking, I see your game. I decline the role. And that quiet defiance, is what makes you dangerous. Because people can argue with words, but they cannot argue with absence. They cannot attack what will not engage. So they twist. They rage. They try to provoke. Because silence is no longer passive. It's a wall they can't climb. And in that silence, something shifts. Not around you, but within you. You begin to see how much energy you've wasted trying to be understood by people who never intended to listen. You remember how many times you broke your own peace just to keep someone else comfortable. How often you filled the air with softness to protect someone else's ego. But silence doesn't protect their ego. It protects your essence. And that essence is no longer up for public consumption. Rollo May said the self is not found in loud declarations, but in quiet authenticity. Silence is your declaration now, not of submission, but of clarity, of separation, of earned stillness. The moment you stop responding, you stop leaking. You stop bleeding out your energy to those who feed on your reaction. You stop trying to fix the image of yourself in someone else's mirror. And that's when they feel it, the absence of your performance, the distance in your stillness, the threat in your peace. Because when you're silent, they can no longer mold you. And when they can't mold you, they fear you. In the next section, we'll explore how silence reclaims the battlefield, and why choosing not to fight is the most strategic move in psychological warfare. Most people believe that communication is made of words, that conflict lives in arguments, that meaning hides in sentences. But Paul Watzlawick, one of the fathers of the Palo Alto School of Communication, shattered that myth. He proved that you can't not communicate. Even silence is a message, especially silence. And that's what unnerves people. When you go quiet, they don't hear nothing. They hear everything. Their mind rushes in to fill the space. Their guilt starts to speak. Their insecurities rise. Because silence removes their ability to control the narrative. They no longer get to interpret your tone, twist your phrasing, reframe your words to serve their comfort. You've taken away their tools, left them exposed to themselves. And that's when silence becomes the most violent form of truth. It's not the absence of communication. It's communication that refuses to be manipulated. Watzlawick taught that silence, in human systems, creates a vacuum of certainty, and that vacuum reveals who clings to control. Because once you stop reacting, they're forced to face the echo chamber of their own intentions. And few people are ready for that level of truth. You've seen it. The moment you stop defending yourself, they panic. The moment you stop engaging, they escalate. Not because you've wronged them, but because they no longer own your attention. And attention is power. You used to think silence meant failure, that if you weren't quick to answer, they'd win. But now you know, the one who speaks first reveals their hand. The one who speaks last is reacting. The one who doesn't speak at all is in control. Silence isn't silence, it's strategy. It redefines the conversation without saying a word. It exposes the imbalance. The person who can sit in silence holds the frame. Watzlawick argued that all behavior is communication, which means your withdrawal, your stillness, your unbothered pause is a statement, and not everyone deserves an answer. Some people provoke you just to keep you locked in their script. But when you break the script, when you fall silent, they don't know who they're talking to anymore. They project, they guess, they grow desperate because silence breaks the illusion of predictability. It says, you don't have access to me anymore. And the moment you become unpredictable, you become powerful. But silence is more than a boundary. It's an invitation. For you, not for them. An invitation to see how many of your responses were rooted in survival, not self-expression. To see how much of your voice was molded by the need to be understood instead of the desire to speak truth. When you choose silence, you stop reacting to the external world and start responding to the internal one. You step back not to punish, but to protect, to conserve, to observe. You begin to watch how they respond when you're no longer feeding the dynamic, and you begin to notice who tries to provoke you back into it. Watzlawick wrote that most people don't want communication, they want confirmation. They want their view of the world mirrored back at them. But your silence refuses to mirror. It refuses to obey. It refuses to affirm their illusion. And that's when the discomfort begins. Because you're no longer participating in the dance. You've left the rhythm, stepped off the stage. You are no longer the echo. You are the absence that unmasks the noise. In the next section, we'll dive how silence dismantles emotional control, and why those who once relied on your reaction will begin to feel exposed in your stillness. Some people don't connect with you. They extract from you. You weren't loved. You were used as a mirror, polished to reflect a version of them they could admire. At first, it felt like closeness, like you were finally needed, seen, important. But slowly, you realized that nothing about the connection was mutual. They never asked how you felt unless it served the storyline, never heard you unless you were praising them. They leaned on you, not for love, but for image. Heinz Kohut, founder of self-psychology, warned us about this hunger. He called it a self-object need, a psychological dependency where fragile egos build their identity through the emotional labor of others. These people don't have a grounded self. They assemble one from reflections. And when you withdraw, when you fall silent, you don't just frustrate them, you shatter their scaffolding. Because your silence isn't just stillness, it's the collapse of the mirror they thought they owned. And that's what makes it dangerous, not because it wounds, but because it reveals they were never whole without your reaction. You were trained to feel guilt for going quiet, to believe that your presence must be maintained, even at the cost of your peace. You thought that withdrawing was cruel, that disengaging made you cold. But Kohut showed us the truth. It's not silence that wounds, it's dependency that demands constant echo. You weren't cruel for stepping back. You were exhausted. You were invisible inside a performance that kept someone else upright. You held space for their stories, their validation, their triumphs. But where were yours? Where was the space for your silence, your stillness, your non-performance? When you chose not to respond, not to affirm, not to rescue, they said you changed. But you didn't change. You returned. You reclaimed the breath they taught you to suppress. And suddenly, their power faded. Not because you attacked, but because you stopped reflecting. Kohut explained that narcissistic systems collapse not from confrontation, but from the quiet removal of the person they depended on. And that's what you did, without screaming, without explanation, just silence. And that silence didn't just break a bond, it broke a spell. And still, a part of you aches. You wonder if you were too harsh, if your silence was abandonment. But it wasn't. It was survival. And now, something is awakening, not in them, but in you. You've started to see how often your identity was shaped by how well you could mirror others. How often your voice bent to protect someone else's sense of self. And now, in the quiet, there's space. Space to hear your own tone. Space to witness yourself without the pressure to reflect anything back. Kohut believed that a healthy self emerges not through being needed, but through being known. And finally, you are knowing yourself, not as a reaction, not as a role, but as a presence that does not require applause to be real. Your silence is not a wall, it is a return. And the ones who only saw themselves in you will call it betrayal. But the truth? You've simply chosen not to vanish anymore. Next, we'll uncover how your silence begins to rewire your sense of self, not as a reaction to others, but as a presence that no longer needs to be witnessed to be real. There's a silence that crushes you, and one that reconstructs you. You used to hold your tongue because your words were unwelcome, not out of wisdom, out of fear. Because when you tried to speak your truth, the room twisted. They heard rebellion when you meant boundary. They called it drama when you named your pain. So you shrank. You learned to study faces before opening your mouth. You rehearsed the most harmless version of your voice, one that wouldn't stir discomfort, one that wouldn't threaten their fragile control. Frantz Fanon, in his work on psychological colonization, described this as the silencing of the self to survive the dominance of others. Though he wrote of race and identity, his ideas cut deeper into how many of us abandon our language, our rhythm, our emotion, just to avoid becoming a target. You weren't silent because you were peaceful. You were silent because you were scanned, judged, reframed. And somewhere in that process, you learned it's safer to be hollow than to be punished for being full. But that was the old silence, the one rooted in fear. The one that left your throat tight and your stomach on fire. Now, you're meeting a new silence, one that doesn't shrink but expands, one that doesn't submit but dominates. Fanon believed that reclaiming the self required a descent into internal rebellion, an emotional uprising. And this silence you hold now, it's not passive, it's the result of revolution. You are no longer quiet to please them. You are quiet because they no longer deserve your sound. You don't withhold out of fear. You withhold out of clarity. They no longer get access, and they can feel it. Because this time, your silence is not emptiness. It's certainty. It's grounded. It does not tremble. It does not bend. You are no longer performing. You are no longer available for deconstruction. You no longer feel the need to make them comfortable with your complexity. You no longer dilute. You no longer chase. The silence you hold now is one that recenters you. It restores your weight in the world. It returns your spine. And those who relied on your submission will call it cold. But you know better. It's integrity. They will say you've changed, that you're distant, detached, but really, you've just reclaimed your edges, the borders they once blurred, and in doing so, you've become something rare, untouchable. Fanon said the colonized mind must learn to speak in its own voice again, but before that, it must go silent. Not the silence of defeat, but of building, of reconfiguring identity, not through reaction, but through self-ownership. That's the silence you carry now. It's not a pause, it's a stance. It's what happens when you've seen enough, said enough, begged enough. And now you sit in the aftermath, not broken, but intact, not soft, but solid. Your silence no longer asks, "Do you see me?" It states, "I see myself." And from that place, the dangerous thing happens. You stop participating in your own diminishment. You stop making yourself digestible. You stop flinching when your wholeness takes up space, because you've tasted a kind of silence that feeds you, not empties you. What comes next is a return to the kind of silence that no longer pleads, it commands. Not all silence is exile. Some silence is sanctuary. You reach a point where the absence of noise is no longer painful. It's necessary. You no longer fear the echo. You begin to crave it, because there, in that stillness, you find something no conversation ever gave you: clarity. You're not hiding. You're incubating, recalibrating. You're not punishing anyone. You're tending to the part of you that was never allowed to breathe without permission. Thomas More, in Care of the Soul, described this sacred interior as a place that cannot be accessed through language or applause. It is the terrain beneath performance, beneath need, beneath persona. And silence, real silence, is what allows you to go there. You don't just retreat from others, you descend into yourself. Not to escape, but to remember. To remember that your worth is not earned through your ability to be heard. It is felt in your capacity to simply be. And that being doesn't require validation. It doesn't require explanation. It only requires space. And silence is space. You were raised in a culture that equated stillness with stagnation. If you weren't moving, you were falling behind. If you weren't speaking, you were irrelevant. But More challenges that. He writes that the soul thrives in silence, because silence strips away the spectacle. In it, there is no more proving, no more performing, no more dancing for scraps of attention. You sit in your truth, not loudly, but deeply. You don't owe anyone your process. You don't need to narrate your healing for it to be real. And the longer you stay in that sacred quiet, the more you realize you were never broken. You were just overexposed. You had too many voices inside your head, too many eyes on your becoming. Silence peels them all away. It becomes the soil where new roots can form, away from judgment, away from distortion. It is in this solitude that you begin to reclaim your intuition, the part of you that whispers, not screams, the part that knows without proof. And in a world obsessed with volume, choosing to hear your own softness is an act of radical self-loyalty. But this silence, this rich, sovereign silence, is not easy to reach. It requires you to let go of the illusion that connection always means proximity, that speaking is always strength, that availability is always virtue. You begin to see the price you paid for being endlessly reachable, for filling every void with words. More reminds us that the soul does not grow under fluorescent lights. It grows in shadow, in solitude, in silence that is not empty but fertile. And now you're learning to dwell there without panic. You're learning to resist the urge to prove you're okay by narrating every insight. You're learning to stay with yourself even when the world goes quiet. And in doing so, you become untouchable, not because you've built walls, but because you've built roots, deep, invisible, sacred. Your silence is no longer a reaction. It's no longer a defense. It's a state of being, a home, a throne. We now move toward the moment where silence no longer isolates you. It unites you with yourself. There is a silence that hides, the one you once used to survive. But then, there is a silence that arrives. It does not crawl from fear or shame. It emerges, sovereign. The silence that no longer pleads to be understood, the one that no longer begs for translation. It doesn't wrap its sharpness in softness. It doesn't shrink for their comfort. This silence radiates. It is not empty. It is not hollow. It is the final shape of self-possession. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, author of Women Who Run with the Wolves, teaches that when a woman stops speaking, it's not because she's disappeared. It's because she's listening to something deeper. This silence is instinctual. It is not passive. It is ritual. It comes after the storm, after the collapse, after the shedding of every false self. It comes when you finally understand that no one is coming to rescue you. And more importantly, no one gets to explain you anymore. You sit, not because you're unsure, but because certainty has made you still. You are no longer dancing to be chosen. You are no longer explaining to be accepted. You are the ending of your old noise and the beginning of your final voice. They will come for it, for this quiet you've built. They'll try to poke holes in it with guilt, with chaos, with twisted memories and sudden affection. They will accuse you of pride, of detachment, of cruelty, because they were never afraid of your anger. They were afraid of your exit. Clarissa writes that there is a wilderness in us that knows when it's time to walk, that knows silence is not absence, but protection. And now you wear it like armor. This is not the silence of resignation. It is the silence of command, the silence of someone who no longer allows others to draft the terms of their reality. You are not punishing them. You are protecting what's left of you. Every word that once escaped your mouth in desperation, gone. Every apology for your own depth, gone. Every need to soften your sharpness, gone. You no longer seek to explain your edge. You stand on it, and they feel it. The threat in your stillness, the echo of everything you will never say again. They will try to bait you back with chaos. But now, you are fluent in peace. And peace does not answer noise. This silence is sacred. It is no longer a pause. It is a punctuation. It is not temporary. It is a new language. A language only the healed can hear. You no longer speak to be seen. You are seen by your own reflection. You no longer bleed to be held. You are held by your own stillness. Clarissa reminds us that the wild soul doesn't roar to be heard. It disappears into the trees and returns changed. That's who you are now. Untraceable to those who only recognized you through your pain. Untouchable to those who once drank your voice like water. You've returned from the fire, fluent in silence. Not as a weapon, but as a declaration. A monument to everything you had to bury just to survive. You have become the stillness that shakes foundations. And now, nothing speaks louder than the silence you wear like armor. If this silence spoke to something in you, let it echo. Subscribe for more truths you won't hear anywhere else. Not because you need more noise, but because sometimes the most powerful thing is knowing you're not the only one who stopped explaining.